welcome to the program. My guest is Steven Rosenfield. Steve is a Charlottesville-based attorney whose clients include Jens Soering, who has been in prison for a double murder for over 30 years. Steve, your client Jens made news recently with a press conference you held petitioning the governor for a pardon. Remind us who Jens Soering is and why he's in prison.
In 1985, he was a freshman at the University of Virginia. He was both a Jefferson Scholar and an Eccles Scholar. That's beyond rare, that combination. He is a German citizen, and while attending, he met Elizabeth Haysom, who was, I'm trying to describe, was sort of everybody wanted to know her and be in her presence. She was 2 years older than Jens, and very, very popular, very attractive, and he was a nerd. She took a special interest in him, which flattered him to no end. He had never had a girlfriend. 3 months after they started dating, her parents were killed in Bedford County, part of the Lynchburg area. The bodies were discovered. At the beginning, neither Jens nor Elizabeth were suspects. And about 2 months after the murders, Soering and Haysom left the country, which made them prime suspects. Interpol was brought into play, and many months later, they were arrested in London for cashing bad checks. Once there, Interpol determined that they were wanted in the United States and contacted the detectives in Bedford County. One detective was sent over to conduct the interrogation. Jens Soering was a volunteer and provided them with information which turned out to be inaccurate, but was the nature of the interrogation was some would argue inept.
So the trial for Jens Soering and Elizabeth Haysom, if memory serves, this was the first time that Virginia had allowed cameras into a courtroom. So it was a huge media event.
In fact,
this young couple, both of whom had confessed, right?
Great memory, Coy, and as a result of those cameras in the courtroom, this was fed nationally. So this became a national story in many circles and followed very carefully. And because it was videoed live and the video saved, later documentary producers from Germany would take apart the actual testimonies of witnesses as part of their documentary.
Right, and I want to ask you about the documentary at some point too, but let's go back to the confessions. She confessed, Elizabeth confessed for having something to do with inspiring and controlling, quote unquote, Jens to murder her parents, and he confessed to actually killing them at first, but then before he goes into the courtroom, he recants, and what does he say?
First, I should tell you that in a most remarkable development, while under British authority, held in custody, there's a document that we submitted to the governor that shows Jens was told to be held incommunicado, unheard of in this country, but allowed over there, even though he was asking for a solicitor. And so
when he was arrested in London.
That's correct.
They wouldn't give him an attorney.
No, and held in isolation, he ultimately decided that I will talk with these people to save Elizabeth's life, because they were in fact subject to capital punishment. Both were subject to being electrocuted, was the only method of execution we have in Virginia. And he was in love with her. It was Romeo and Juliet, and he would sacrifice himself to try to spare her from being executed. And so he decided, without advice of counsel, that he would talk to the Virginia detective and
who had flown to London to speak with him, right?
Exactly, and tried to persuade him that he was the killer. And what is so remarkable is that this detective, this was his first homicide case as lead detective, never bothered to ask him or confront him. No, Jens, that's not correct. The bodies weren't located there. No, Jens, that's not what Nancy Haysom was wearing. Later, earlier this spring, we found the most renowned expert on police interrogation and confessions in the world. He's London-based, started out as a bobby and became the highest level detective, travels the world teaching, writing, lecturing about proper police interrogation. He reviewed the entire Soering file and concluded that Soering's confession was unreliable.
So just to bring people up to speed, Soering confessed to save this young woman that he loved, and his motivation was the fact that my dad works for the German Foreign Service. He's a German national. I'm not going to get tried in America. They're going to have to send me to, this is what he's thinking, he's wrong, but he's thinking they're going to have to send me to Germany to be tried, and at the most I might get 10 years. I'll be out in less than 10 years. Elizabeth will be innocent because I'm going to take the rap for her. She'll be out in a few years, if at all, anytime, and we'll be together. That's what he's thinking as a kid.
Terrific research. You've got all of that correct. In Germany, in fact, as a juvenile, tried as a juvenile, and there it's your teenage years. He was 18 at the time of the crime, 19 when he was arrested. He would have served, maximum punishment would have been 8 years in Germany. So that was his thinking.
Right.
And his father was a low-level diplomat for the German government. He was stationed in Detroit. You don't think of high-level diplomats being stationed in Detroit, later transferred to Atlanta.
But Elizabeth was found guilty of orchestrating the murders. She testifies against Jens.
Correct.
And again, in this nationally publicized trial, before there was OJ, there was this case in Virginia. It was just huge news. Jens is sent away. She's sent away for 90 years. He is sent away for 2 life terms for these murders.
That's right.
That he tried to recant the confession. Well, he did recant the confession. They didn't buy it.
That's correct. Ultimately found guilty, notwithstanding his explanations for why he was trying to spare her life. But the defense counsel, the lead defense counsel, would later return to Detroit, Michigan. He was not a Virginia lawyer, did not know how to practice law in Virginia. He would later throw himself on the mercy of the Michigan State Bar, claiming that he was mentally impaired both during the preparation and trial of Jens Soering. Some of his defense work was adequate, some of it was substandard.
So you have petitioned now, fast forward over 30 years later. Jens is in prison. You have now petitioned for his pardon from Governor McAuliffe. What's the grounds of the pardon, Steve? What's in the document that you sent the governor that you can point to, and you can tell these people who are watching, Jens Soering is innocent. He didn't kill this couple back in the 80s. How do you know that? What's the evidence that you look at today and you say, this is why we don't think he's guilty?
3 matters came together in the spring and mostly this summer. One was the documentary movie The Promise, in which the producers spent 2 years interviewing people that I didn't know existed, who were very, very helpful in given the nature of our petition. The second was the false confession that our expert submitted a report. But the third is just overwhelming. In 1985, there was a serology report identifying blood types of the many items that were submitted by law enforcement
from the crime scene.
From the crime scene. Of those, only 5 were identified as being type O blood. Derek Haysom had type A, Nancy Haysom had type AB, Elizabeth Haysom had type B, Jens had type O. The prosecution used that, as you can well imagine, ranting and raving to the jury that type O blood found at the scene of the crime, knife fight by the killer. Jens Soering has type O blood. It was Jens Soering who committed those murders, and science proves it.
And this is before DNA testing in courtrooms, right?
It's before DNA testing. And then in 2009, Governor Kane established a commission, and this was post-conviction review of closed cases where there were still items that could be DNA tested. Jens' case was just one of many. And of the 43 samples that they looked at that had blood, only 5 of those were type O, and of those 5, 3 were too degraded to test. So they tested the 2 samples that were type O blood found on the screen door about 2 to 3 feet from the Derek Haysom's body.
And this was the type O blood that the prosecution had said back in the trial, this is the blood of Jens Soering, Jens Soering on the crime scene. This is his blood. So in 2009, they test the DNA of that same blood, and what do they find?
He was eliminated.
It's not his blood.
They do not type blood on DNA reports, but they do look to the location on the DNA strand to see if it's male or female, and it turned out that both of these had an X and Y chromosome, so the report could say that those 2 samples were a contributor with type O blood, and it was a male. But Jens Soering specifically was excluded. So we know 2 things from that. One, Jens Soering was not the contributor of the blood that the prosecutor said was the single killer. There was only one killer, he kept telling the jury, and it was Jens with type O blood. So we know he's eliminated, but it also means that somebody else is the killer with a DNA profile that is unique.
It's not Jens' DNA in that blood that was found at the scene, in the type O blood. It's not his DNA.
Absolutely, and we are hoping that the governor, who I have I have confidence from having done the Robert Davis case with him, that he really cares about justice issues, and I know that he will ask his staff of investigators to look at that DNA profile and let's check to see if it's in a data bank.
It would be the obvious thing to do, right? To get that DNA and to run it through the data bank and see, well, if it doesn't match Jens Soering, maybe it matches somebody in the data bank.
Well, why didn't the lead detective who flew to Great Britain, he had the report in 2009. Now, the reason that we didn't make this connection is that Jens Soering, as a prisoner, can only have but so many pieces of paper in his cell. He sent to Germany tens of thousands of pages of documents to be stored over there. So when he got the DNA test revealing that he was eliminated, what he didn't know was that the serology report from 1985 had type O blood tested when the DNA was tested. So it took till the summer that we got the 1985 report, but the detective in Bedford County had the 1985 serology report, and when he saw Soering was eliminated, you would think he would have looked at the 11 items of evidence that were tested to determine if any of them were type O blood. I don't know the answer. I don't know if he did and he's remained silent. I don't know if he did and he privately investigated to see who contributed that type O blood, or if he's completely ignored or is lost and doesn't know what he's doing. I don't know the answer.
Steve, let's take a quick break and let's talk about this more right when we get back. A very quick break, and stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're talking with Steve Rosenfield. Steve's client, Jens Soering, has recently petitioned Governor McAuliffe for a pardon for a double murder he was convicted of committing back in the 1980s. I want to just really stress this point here, Steve. He was convicted before we had the use of DNA evidence in courtrooms. Now that we do, we find his DNA is not at the scene. His DNA is not in the blood that prosecutors said was his blood and that he alone was responsible. But there's other stuff besides the DNA. I mean, there's the witness who rented the car who says, yeah, Elizabeth Haysom came back with a rent-a-car and there was blood in the car and she was with a guy who wasn't Jens Soering, who had wounds and cuts on him. There's the fact that Jens was convicted, his sock footprint matched a sock found on the crime scene. Like a sock print is like a fingerprint. That's ludicrous to think of, that people would take that seriously back in the mid-'80s, but they did. It's like having a glove on your hand. It's just amazing.
Let me just quickly correct you, because it's a critical piece of evidence. The car was rented on a Friday, taken to Washington, D.C. They stayed Friday night, Saturday.
Jens and Elizabeth.
Jens and Elizabeth. It was rented to Elizabeth. They returned the car on Sunday. The murders occurred Saturday night, when our theory is Elizabeth went back home and helped in the murders. She testified that on Saturday night in Georgetown, she was standing outside of a movie theater and Jens drove by in the rental car. He was covered from head to toe in a white sheet. The next morning, the car was returned to the rental agency, and the agent testified at the trial that the car was spotless. Furthermore, the detective testified that they used luminol, which is a spray chemical that will detect the most minute elements of blood. Virtually impossible to erase the blood. And here was a car with upholstery, with crevices in the gas pedal and
so
brake pedal.
So there's no blood in the rental car?
No blood in the rental car.
Okay.
But that was her testimony. There is no physical evidence tying Jens to the crime scene. And the sock print, you're exactly right to laugh. The non-expert that was called by the prosecution, and I call him that because the judge refused to recognize him as an expert in sock impression. He was a tire expert. But the judge said he could nevertheless testify about the sock. And the joke really is how it was admissible. In 1985 and since then, the American Association of Forensic Scientists, for instance, 132 of them, declared long before 1985 that sock print impressions is not science.
It's junk science.
It's junk science.
At best, and that's being nice, because you're using the word science in there. It's got nothing to do with science.
Professor Brandon Garrett, known to this community because he's a professor at the University of Virginia and works on innocence cases, teamed up with Peter Neufeld from the New York Innocence Project, and they wrote a law review article tracking the history of various kinds of evidence which is junk science, and they included sock print. So if you throw out the sock print evidence as any rational person should do, you throw out the blood, and you throw out Elizabeth Haysom's testimony because she just couldn't be accurate in so many different ways. And then you have to look at Jens's own confession, put aside that he has an expert that says his confession was unreliable, but he couldn't get the facts straight of a murder that he
supposedly says he did, and he couldn't even describe the crime scene.
Exactly.
I'm not a lawyer. You're the lawyer. But I'll tell you what, when I look at this stuff and I read this stuff, I look at a case, a horrific double murder, an awful tragedy. You have this kid who says he did it, and the police take that and start working backwards. And so it's all just confirmation bias. If they run into it, which the confirmation bias is what gave us a Rolling Stone article about a rape that never happened. They start working backwards, and looking at things like, well, there's the sock, and if there's anything that even remotely looks like it might be evidence, they take it as a rationale for conviction because they're working backwards from a confession that they believe and that a kid wanted them to believe.
That bias is powerful. It prevents good interrogators or interviewers, as they call them in Great Britain, from asking the right questions and not be satisfied that because somebody confessed that it is truthful. So for instance, Jens was not asked very many before, during, or after questions. Oh, for how long did you plan to commit the murders? Did you anticipate what weapon you would use? How did you determine that it would be a knife? Do you have any experience with a knife? You're just he was about 120 pounds. Derek Haysom was about 6'3", 260 pounds. Mr. Soering, did you contemplate how you would pull off killing these two people? Well, why would you do it? Now, as it turns out, the lead detective has been interviewed and has said that he was furious with the Haysom parents. He hated them. There was no evidence at trial. The prosecution told the jury the motive was because they wouldn't let him continue to see Elizabeth. There is absolutely no evidence. Not a single witness was put on the witness stand, including Elizabeth Haysom, to say that Jens had any animosity. And in fact, Jens had met them one time for 30 minutes.
And there was an FBI profiler at the time who said, based on the research, it looks like a woman who had access and knew this couple was guilty of the murders.
Very good. That's exactly right. And indeed, the present lead investigator who was on the case back then, he says there never was an FBI profiler. And Ed Sulzbach is on video. He died, but before that he gave a video interview in which he said, "Oh, sure, I remember the Haysom case. I went to the scene. I inspected the scene. I interviewed."
Who's he?
And Ed Sulzbach is an FBI profiler, and the lead detective said, "No, he wasn't there. No, we didn't know anything about a profile. Oh, we would have to have turned it over to the defense."
But they're denying they ever, yeah.
This lead detective is denying it.
Do you think Jens is innocent?
Yes.
What should the governor do? And he's not likely to do anything before the presidential election. I guess that's the elephant in the room.
You know, I don't think that this governor is swayed by the politics. I learned in Robert Davis's case that justice is really paramount. If a mistake was made, what is the downside to him? If a mistake was made, especially with the DNA exoneration, how does he look bad? Why would politics even enter into it before or after? Now, quite frankly, investigations go through the parole board, and they have many, many people ahead of the Jens Soering case who also proclaim to be innocent. So
he has to be patient.
He has to be patient. This is a 2017 likely outcome.
But the fact that you submitted the petition for him with all this new evidence and calling into question the evidence that convicted him over 30 years ago, or 1990, that means that he is officially on a list to be reviewed.
And indeed, when the evidence is as compelling as this, it makes for an easier investigation. When you have scientific evidence totally refuting the government's theory of the case, it can catapult you to the top of the list and maybe get you relief earlier.
What's the likelihood, before it's investigated, that law enforcement or anybody will run that DNA from the crime scene through the data bank?
Well,
zero?
Law enforcement should embrace changes in information. And you would like to think that law enforcement everywhere would say, listen, if a mistake was made and we have the wrong guy, it means that there's somebody out there.
That's not what they do, Steve. You know that. That's not what they do.
You're exactly right.
They live in a world of absolutes. And Jens is guilty, he was found guilty, he's in prison, move on.
Ego, false pride, it all gets in the way of sound judgment, and it's very disappointing because there are estimated to be 1,000 or more people in our Virginia system that are innocent, completely innocent, just in the Virginia system.
Because of the clumsy way the system works.
Yes, people who don't have, can't afford
Right.
decent lawyers, resources aren't made available to them.
Let me ask you this, Steve. We only got a couple of minutes left, but
Sure.
what is your response to those who watched that case years ago and they were glued to the story and they've been following the story ever since? What's your response to them, to those who believe Jens Soering is absolutely guilty? I saw that trial. I've known this story from the very beginning. He's a cold-blooded killer.
Well, their world must be turned upside down when they realize that his blood is not at the scene. And then you can work backwards from there and say, well, maybe his confession also was not accurate, and understand that the world's most renowned expert in this area says, indeed, it was unreliable. And then when the movie comes to North America, it will be here this coming fall, The Promise. It's an exquisite movie because it is so detailed in outlining the case, and they did not have the benefit of the DNA analysis.
So you add that on top of this.
So you add that on top of it.
Promise me you'll come back when there's any kind of development in this and we'll talk more.
Glad to do it.
Okay, thank you, Steve. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Steve Rosenfield, a Charlottesville attorney. His client, Jens Soering, has petitioned Governor McAuliffe for a review and a pardon of his conviction. I'm Coy Barefoot. You can find the complete archive of the program online at mediaandcitizenship.org. Have a terrific week, and y'all be good to each other.